Now to the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP as it's called. It's not a great name. Maybe they should find another one, because this week deep divisions emerged in the European Parliament over the EU's planned trade deal with the US. The European Parliament's president, he's called Martin Schulz, decided to postpone a vote on the trade negotiations. Then MEPs voted to postpone a debate on the issue. So what's all the fuss about? Here's our Joko.
Protesters up in arms over plans for a free trade agreement between the EU and the US outside the European Parliament this week. It's also fiercely divided opinion amongst MEPs inside the building, and tempers frayed when a vote and debate on TTIP, scheduled for Wednesday, were cancelled at the 11th hour.
To decide to delay the vote is, to our delegation anyway, a big problem in terms of how it's perceived by the citizens of Europe.
We've spent weeks preparing for this week's debate and vote.
Millions of people are waiting to hear what we're going to do today. And you're simply sweeping this aside.
Given
the lack of agreement between the groups, not just the majority groups but the lack of agreement between all the groups in the resolution, President Schulz quite wisely decided to postpone the vote.
What is this European Parliament where the President decides to manipulate the rules because he's afraid of not getting a majority on this?
So if there are 40 members in this House willing to stand up now, we can force a vote on whether to stop the plenary completely.
Sit down, please.
These scenes follow months of horse trading between different political groups in the Parliament, when the key players thought they'd reached agreement. And then the chamber was empty, and remained so for most of the morning. The MEP's Trade Committee now has 200 or so amendments to consider, and a vote on this controversial issue looks highly unlikely in this place before September. Events this week have triggered a TTIP blame game. The biggest group in the Parliament, the European People's Party, and their allies on this issue, the Liberals, seem to be pointing the finger at the Socialists.
The President of this House, who's a Social Democrat, has used his discretion to postpone the vote. It's unfortunate because the chairman of the INTA committee, who's also the leading rapporteur for this important file, had given his word. And we have negotiated a compromise on 60 topics, which have been supported and voted and accepted in the International Trade Committee by the 4 major political groups, including the Social Democrats. And everyone can imagine that it's really unpleasant.
The real sticking point here is over the highly charged issue of investor protection, a system known as the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, or ISDS. It's a private arbitration system which allows companies in one country to sue governments in another country if an investment runs into problems.
Perhaps they were useful 20 years ago, but in a modern society where democratic parliaments decide on the necessary developments in society, I think there's no legitimation to give foreign investors more rights than domestic investors.
Supporters of TTIP say it'll open up new markets in both the US and Europe. EU-based companies would be able to sell their products in America without paying prohibitively high tariffs, expand their businesses and compete more effectively in a globalized world. Critics claim democracy is being traded away.
Companies might sue states if they change their laws, for example, when it comes to energy. Now we have a case in Germany where a Swedish company is suing the state of Germany because the parliament decided to phase out nuclear power. So in that sense, it is a danger to public lawmaking.
Either way, TTIP is a big deal for Europe. Postponing the vote by MEPs isn't a deal breaker at this point in the negotiations, but their approval will be necessary for the final trade pact to go ahead.
That was Joko. We're joined now by David Babs. He's the executive director of the pressure group 38 Degrees. And you're broadly against TTIP, am I right?
Well, our members are very concerned about some of the provisions of TTIP.
What is the thing that causes you most concern?
Well, I would say there are three big concerns. The first is the secrecy surrounding the deal itself, that these are important questions that will affect all of us, yet a lot of the detail is hidden from the public, and that just can't be the right way to do these things. Secondly, there's a real risk that important protections that we have in Europe for shoppers, for employees, for the environment could be dragged down to lower American standards if this deal goes through. And thirdly, and I think this is what we were hearing about particularly this week, the ISDS measures within TTIP.
No, you have to explain that.
Well, it's basically a proposal to create a different legal system, different courts, specifically for big corporations.
To decide justice on the agreement if there are disputes.
It would hand power to
adjudicate.
to companies to essentially take a democratically elected government to court if that government enacts a policy which that corporation doesn't like, and
or would be seen to be, in the view of the corporation, in breach of the agreement. Is that what it would be? Because corporations can take governments to court now.
But this would create a different legal system through which they could do that. And
what do you say?
Well, there are 3 points. The first one about transparency. This is a deal that's had more scrutiny than any other free trade agreement the EU's ever done. And
but he says there's some of the details we still don't know.
Some of the issues that strike me right now is that a lot of the issues being discussed are out there. When I was getting a lot of emails from your group, I was sending back responses outlining where the details were, where the information was, the work done by the International Trade Committee, so that people could see it. And the response was remarkably positive. Thank you for letting me see this. Thank you for giving me this information. We were told there was nothing about it, and in truth there is. The second thing is, this is not creating this system of tribunals. The notion of dispute settlement exists and has existed for quite some time. And the important difference here is the Commission have made substantial improvements, and I mean substantial improvements, in how this will be done in this particular approach compared to all the others. As well as that, not only that, they've taken it off the negotiating table right now to make even more improvements into this, to make sure that companies can't, on a whim, sue a government just because they give a dent in their profits. To my mind, we need to make sure these negotiations look at this in detail, and it needs reform. Of course it does. But to take it off the table entirely is premature.
Where are you on this?
Well, first off, hats off to 38 Degrees, and thank you for bringing this to the attention of so many people, because what we've not seen is sufficient public engagement within this process.
No, it's not been a great matter of... It came up during the Scottish referendum because in relation to the health service. But it's not been a huge matter of public debate, has it?
If a trade deal being negotiated by the European Commission on behalf of the member states, that's not unusual, but that's about tariffs on widget imports and that sort of stuff, nuts and bolts stuff. TTIP is way bigger than that. It's about the corporate courts, actually, I think is a better way of describing ISDS. And I'm a former corporate lawyer, and I find the idea that if you're talking about investments in North Korea, say, I could see a need for a specific set of safeguards for investors. But you're talking about some of the most developed legal systems in the world.
Why do we need separate courts?
Well, I don't think we do, which is why we oppose TTIP.
And yet this is part, separate courts are part of the TTIP arrangement.
Exactly, and they are a part of the TTIP arrangement, which we... It seems like the proponents of them, the best they can say is that they aren't as sinister as we're worried about. No one is able to make a positive case for them, other than that it hands new powers to corporations.
Who wants these separate courts? I mean, is it the Americans pushing for it, or is it the Europeans?
Well,
or is it the lawyers?
To my mind,
because they always like to push for more courts.
I'm a former lawyer for the avoidance of doubt.
I'm married to a lawyer, but the reality remains.
They're everywhere.
What we've got to look at is, how do these things work? Do they work well or not? Now, the UK has a number of agreements it has in its various trade agreements in the past. Not once have we been found in breach of any of these. But to my mind, we talk about the US as a developed court system. It is. But at certain levels in the US approach, the judges are elected, and they've got to appeal to a populist mass. Now, there's every possibility there. You could see discrimination entered into that as they go for the America First approach. We need to look at this, and in my mind is the ISDS clause, the dispute settlement, the corporate courts, however you want to call it, needs to be looked at. It needs reform, and it needs to be approached.
But you say it needs reform, but it hasn't even been started. It hasn't started yet.
The thing is, no.
And you already want to reform it.
No, the material that's out there just now from the Commission is demonstrating what they want to do to make it different from the existing settlement procedures in the other free trade agreements.
As a general principle, would it be a good or bad thing to have free trade between the European Union and the United States?
I don't think anyone is against improving commercial relationships between Europe and America. What we're concerned about is a deal which at the moment seems to be more about handing new powers to corporations, a whole separate legal system for corporations to...
Who've got big lawyers.
Yes, of course, and to challenge democratically elected governments when those governments do things that those corporations don't like, and a removal of protections for our public services, for shoppers, for employees. And that's what seems to be driving TTIP at the moment, rather than improving commercial relationships. And I think that's why the public is so concerned about this, and why we're looking to our MEPs to scrutinise the deal more and to throw out the bits for which there is no justification.
Now, 3 years ago, the BBC asked me to go to Strasbourg to give a short speech to MEPs.
We remember it well. We're still talking about it.
Are you really? Good. I'm glad, because I said to you at the time that I thought this TTIP would be a lot more difficult than many MEPs thought, because of resistance forces on both sides of the Atlantic. If this was a US show, we'd be having a debate about this too. There's going to be a new president. It's by no means sure that Congress will give fast track to get this through. Many people, including myself, think Mr. Obama is more interested in a Pacific trade deal than a European one. Is it going to happen?
The jury's out, and this is where it's so important that we scrutinise this properly, because we need to be clear about what's being agreed on our behalf, and this is where the European Parliament is the democratic, transparent bit of this process, so we can bring that to light. But you're right, I mean, speak to the Canadians about the free trade deal that they've got with America. Buy American, buy transatlantic, buy North European. The Americans themselves are promising stuff they're not that keen on delivering, so I think the jury's very much out, but we can't deal on the basis that it's going to fail.
Just very briefly, will it happen or not?
I suspect not before the start of the presidential election, and after that it depends on the result of that presidential election.
So that's a while away then, because that's
so.
2016, then a new president comes in 2017. Thank you very much for going through that with us.